everybody, welcome back to Biblical Greek Made Easy. This is Class 5 of Module 2, and today we're going to be talking about the imperfect indicative verbs, the first of the past tenses we're going to learn. But before we talk about that too much, I want to share with you the verse of the day. Psalm 107 verse 1 says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever." And guys, I'm in a thankful mood today. I've got gratitude today. I'm just very aware of all the good things that God does for me. And the psalmist agrees. The psalmist pronounces to his congregation, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good." And I'm just thankful for God's goodness. I'm thankful for his steadfast love, how it just enfolds me. And God does so many great things for me. I know he does great things for you too. And so let's just join in gratitude today with grateful hearts, giving thanks to the Lord. And think about of all the people who followed Jesus in the last several thousand years, so few of them have had the opportunity to do what we do. You know, the freedom to study Greek whenever they want to, the access to resources and literacy and education and all that kind of stuff, and access to a Bible. All that stuff is absolute privilege, and I'm just so thankful for that. So join me in having a grateful heart today. Here's the tip of the day as we get started. Okay, the tip of the day is to trust your training. Okay, trust your training. I'm going to teach you a system, a model of how to identify verbs today, because as things continue to get more complicated, we just need training to deal with it. Okay, so I'm going to teach you the Biblical Greek Made Easy method of identifying verbs, and I think it's going to help you a lot. It's helped a lot of students over the years. Okay, and you don't get it anywhere else but right here at biblicalgreekmadeeasy.com. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about why this matters. Okay. So, imperfect verbs, as I mentioned, this is the first of the past tenses that we're going to learn in this course, okay? In English, we only kind of think about having one past tense. We actually use helping words to make a few others, but Greek is going to have three different past tenses that we're going to learn kind of in rapid succession here, okay? And today we're talking about the first one. Also, imperfect is used for about 15% of the verb occurrences in the New Testament. So that means it's a little bit rare, but when it happens, it's really important, okay? There's kind of some theological Easter eggs that open up. When the authors use imperfect, they're using it for a reason. They're trying to communicate something, okay? And so I'll give you an example of that maybe as we go along here as well. But let's go ahead and get started. Past tense verbs is what we're going to talk about first. So in English, we talked about there's kind of just one simple past tense. At least that's how we think of it, okay? The aspect can change. Remember we said aspect is what kind of action we're talking about, continuous action or undefined action. So let me give you an example. So the couple of example sentences here. "I forcefully removed the rubber chicken from my ballroom tuxedo." Notice how we love ridiculous sentences here, right? We can have either boring sentences or fun sentences. Let's choose some fun sentences. So, forcefully removed. Removed is really the verb there. And notice how that's past tense, removed, ed, past tense. But it's also just an undefined action. We don't know much about the aspect. It's an undefined aspect, okay? Notice the second example there. "I was forcefully removing the rubber chicken from my ballroom tuxedo," okay? Notice that one. I was removing. Forcefully is our adverb there, but was removing in this case is the verb. And so in this case, was goes to past tense in English, and then removing becomes an ing participle kind of thing, right? So this is how English does it. It's going to do it in kind of weird ways. But notice how we have past continual action in that second example. It's not that you removed you forcefully removed the rubber chicken. It's that you were forcefully removing. I was forcefully removing. So it creates this idea that like it's happening right now. Even though we're talking about the past, it's continual action. It's ongoing action in time is the idea, okay? And so Greek is going to have these multiple past tenses, and they're going to use these different tenses for different aspects, okay? So we talked about this before. When we talk about tense in Greek, we tend to think time as English thinkers and speakers, okay? But aspect is going to be more important, okay? So there's going to be three different past tenses that we learn, and those are going to have different aspects, each one, okay? So the imperfect tense describes past continual action. That's really important. Past continual action. Why do we call it imperfect? Well, that's an old grammatical word that goes back a ways. I know some Greek teachers have changed that to call it the past continual tense, okay? That's fine. But the scholarship, the commentaries that you read, any grammar book you pick up, they're all going to call it imperfect, okay? So that's how we're going to remember it. It's the imperfect tense, but that's past continual action is what we're talking about there. Mount says this about the imperfect. He says, there are many ways to use the imperfect. Sometimes it helps us to see wonderful theology. Other times it gives quiet hints to the careful reader as to what is happening and invites them to join the parade. Okay, so that's just kind of a teaser about what imperfect verbs are going to do. As I said, they're going to be exegetically significant, and there's going to be some Easter eggs. Okay, so let's talk about the endings, okay, before I build these for you. The endings chart, we've seen two sets of endings so far. In our endings chart, we have 4 quadrants, and the 2 left quadrants, the primary endings, active and middle passive, those have all been filled in, okay? We have 2 more sets of endings that we're going to fill in today, okay? So we've seen the primary active and the primary passive. What does primary mean? Do you remember what we said previously? I'm not sure if we said that before. Primary for you probably just means left side of the chart, right? Well, primary actually means primary tenses do not take an augment, okay? We haven't talked about augments yet, but we're going to learn what those are here in just a minute. Primary tenses do not take an augment. Secondary tenses do take an augment, okay? So if we have secondary endings, they're going to take an augment, okay? So this really has more to do with the ending than anything else, okay? An augment is a prefix that indicates past time. So it's usually an epsilon that's going to go on the front of a word, okay? And so that's going to change it. It's going to look different, okay? You have verbs with augments and verbs without augments. And if it has an augment, that's going to indicate past time, okay? And it's going to go on the front. And so when we talk about primary, secondary tenses, secondary tenses, they're going to have an augment out on the front. And so they're going to need different endings on the backside in order to balance that out, okay? So I tell my students that because we have an augment on the front, we need an industrial strength ending on the back end in order to balance the word out. You can't have your normal primary endings on the end of a word that has an augment out front. It's not strong enough. It'll be out of balance. It'll flip it out of whack, right? And so if you can kind of think of those two together, if you have an augment, you need a secondary ending, a different kind of ending. And so we're going to learn those endings today. So here's what the endings chart looks like, as you've seen before. We've got the primary endings on the left and the secondary endings on the right. The top half of the chart is our active endings, and the bottom half of the chart is our middle passive endings. Okay, so that's what you know so far. Like I said, we're going to fill in the rest of that chart today. Okay, the 4 sets of endings on the chart are all the personal endings you need to know. That's good news, okay? There's not like some secret chart somewhere that has like 6 more slots in it or something like that. Those 4 are it. Now, I put a little asterisk there at the end after no, because as you may suspect with Greek, there's always some exceptions. As we learn new tenses, sometimes endings will be a little bit different just for that tense. So it's not learning a new set of endings, but there can always be a little weirdness that creeps in. And again, if you think Greek is weird, just remember English is 10 times weirder, 50 times weirder, right? And so we're happy that we're learning Greek and not English because, way fewer exceptions in Greek than in English, okay? So let's go ahead and build our imperfect, active, indicative verbs. So we're going to start with that augment out front, okay? Or you might think about starting with the stem and then adding an augment in the front, but however way you look at that, the augment comes first. And then we're going to have our imperfect tense stem, which is built on the present tense stem in almost all cases, most cases for sure. The stem that we're building the word on is going to be the exact same stem we saw in the present, which is the stem that we know. That's good news. So the augment plus the imperfect tense stem, plus our connecting vowel to just smooth out translation. Remember, we're not going to worry too much about connecting vowels. They can be there if they want to be there, but they don't have to be there. And then finally, our secondary active endings, which remember, we said secondary endings are there to balance out the augment on the front, and we haven't seen those yet. We're going to learn those today. And so we get, you see the epsilon and the lu and the ah and the nu. So we get eluon, right? That's our new word, eluon. And so our practice sentence there, eluon ton oikon, I was destroying the house, or I was loosing the house. I was destroying the house, okay? So here's our paradigm with our endings there. Eluon, elus, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluon, okay? So I would encourage you to memorize this as quickly as possible. This will be good to have in your head because when you encounter one of these words, you want to be able to just kind of rattle through it quickly in your brain, okay? The quicker, the better. So just know this cold. And again, I think it's easier to memorize this as the actual paradigm of luo. So it's actually connected to words rather than just endings hanging in the air, not connected to anything. But of course, do what works best for you. But let's go ahead and look at the paradigm here. And you see up and down. What are some things you notice about that paradigm? Yeah, well, you may notice that third person singular is fairly normal. That's kind of what we would expect. It's got the movable nu. First person plural is exactly what we would expect with the men ending there, as is second person plural, the te ending, okay? You probably notice that first person singular and third person plural have the same ending. So the form is exactly the same, eluon versus eluon. Okay. Now my students are always concerned that this is going to be confusing, and I assure them every time that it won't be. Okay, this will not be confusing, I promise you. Okay, at least when you're translating sentences and you're translating the New Testament, there won't be a time where it's going to be confusing whether it's first person singular or third person plural. It'll be very obvious, okay? It's sort of like, this isn't the greatest example in the world, but when you're reading English, how often does the word, a bass guitar versus a bass fish, how often do you get those confused when you're reading different things? Well, almost never, right? I mean, even though they're different words that are spelled exactly the same, they almost never show up at the same time, and even if they did, I mean, the context is going to make it perfectly clear which one it is. That's the same thing here, okay? It's not going to be confusing. We just gotta remember, like if we're parsing, for example, if this shows up in a parsing example, we need to remember that it can be both, okay? So that's an important thing to keep an eye on. But as far as the repetition of ending, not that big of a deal, okay? So let's talk about middle passive indicative for the imperfect, okay? So it's going to be the same type deal. We're going to build it the same way, okay? So we're going to have that augment. We're going to have that imperfect tense stem, which remember is the present tense stem again. We're going to have the connecting vowel, and then our secondary middle passive personal endings, which again, you haven't seen yet, but we're going to show them to you right now. So in this case, the first person plural, for example, is aluamen. Aluamen, okay? We were being destroyed. Okay, for the passive. Or we were destroying ourselves if we were going to do it middle, okay? Or we were loosing ourselves, we were being loosed, something like that, okay? So here is the imperfect middle passive endings, the middle column there. You see imperfect active on the left. I just showed you that for comparison, but look at imperfect middle passive there. We get eluamen, eluu, eluata, eluamatha, eluesta, and eluanta, okay? You see the endings there on the right, main, sa, ta, metha, stha, and nta, okay? Again, I think easier to remember connected to the words. Notice that first person singular, it ends in main, similar to the my that we see in our primary endings, right? But a little bit different, main. Don't get that fused with the mena ending for first person plural, okay? Second person singular, we're kind of used to being weird. It's sa, sigma, omicron there. But the sigma drops out, so we get elu, okay? That's a weird one. We just got to memorize that one. Eluata is a little bit easier. Notice how it corresponds to third person plural down there. Eluanta, okay? Similar to luatai and luantai for the active as well, so similar there. Eluamatha, okay? Fairly common, what we would expect. Eluestha, once again, fairly common, what we would expect. And then eluanta, we mentioned, okay? So that's our secondary middle passive endings. And let's go ahead and look at our chart. We have all 4 quadrants of the chart filled in. And I will just tell you this right now, those secondary middle passive endings are the ones that students struggle with the most, okay? I don't think it's because they're harder. Maybe they're a little bit harder. They're not impossible, though. The reason they struggle with them the most is because those endings show up the least, okay? They just don't show up nearly as often as everything else. And so when repetition is low, our memories fade, okay? And so I've been trying to remind you that in this course too, that, you know, practice and repetition is what really helps you memorize this. But just kind of star those bottom right endings in your notes to know that they do take a while. They take some repetition. They take some practice in order to get good with them. So ideally, you would have all 4 of the paradigms on this chart memorized to where you could rattle them off at will, okay? Why does that help you? Well, then when you get to a word and you see an ending and you're like, oh man, what is this? You have them kind of at the ready where you can just rattle them off really quickly and figure out what it is. And we're going to talk about how to identify verbs here in just a little bit too. But that'll just really, really help you if you can have these at the ready in your head. Practice those, make flashcards, know them cold. That'll really help your translation, okay? So let's talk about augments a little bit more, okay? So remember, an augment indicates past time. It's usually going to occur by adding an epsilon to the front of the word, okay? So luo becomes eluon, for example, as we saw before. But what if the word begins with a vowel, okay? If we had a word that began with a vowel and we threw an epsilon on the front, what's that going to do to the word? Well, we're going to have some contraction going on with the vowels, as you can imagine. It's going to lengthen the vowel on the front, and that's basically the shorthand. That's basically what you need to remember. If we have a verb that starts with a vowel, the vowel is going to lengthen, and that is going to be our augment, okay? So when we're looking for augments, we don't want to just look for epsilons on the front. We want to look for lengthened vowels on the front, okay? And so, for example, agapao becomes agapone, okay? So notice we get that new ending on the end. This is a contract verb, so we get the own there on the ending, okay? But notice on the front, rather than an alpha, we have an eta, so we get agapone, okay? And you can look at the full rules for augments if you want to on pages 228 and 229 of the 4th edition of Mounts if you're following along in that textbook, okay? But what if the word has a prefix? Here's another wrinkle you need to know about, okay? If we have a word like ekbalo, where we have a prefix before the verb, what's going to happen is the augment is going to go behind the prefix but before the stem, okay? So rather than ekbalo or something like that, the lengthening of the eta there, we're going to get exebalo, okay? Now you'll notice in this example, the kappa changed to a kasi, okay? That's actually because the kasi is original to this word, and it changes to a kappa because it comes up against the beta. That goes back further than we need to know. Just know this wrinkle. Exebalon is the imperfect active indicative first person singular or third person plural form of ekbalo, okay? So it means I was throwing out, or they were throwing out, or casting out, right? But just, that's something you have to look for. You got to find the augment hidden between the prefix there, okay? Now, there's only a handful of vocabulary words that we know that have those prefixes, but we just need to look for that. We got to make sure that we're keeping an eye out for that, okay? Well, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to teach you the Biblical Greek Made Easy method of verbal recognition, okay? One of the first things I developed when I was teaching years ago, I was teaching a group of seminary students about verbs, and they were really struggling with it because there's so many layers and so many wrinkles and so many things going on, and there's 4 sets of endings and the different augments and the different stems and the different tense formatives and all this kind of stuff. How do you keep all this stuff straight? And so what I did is I came up with a system of how to identify this, and it's a 4-step process that we go through, and it's really our training. So you know how emergency medical people or military people or people in extreme situations, they have this training, okay? And when things get tough, when things get hairy, they resort to their training, and in a lot of cases it saves their lives, okay? They don't let themselves get distracted by what's going on. They just focus on the training, and that's what saves them. And so that's what we're going to try to do, is when all sorts of crazy things are going on, we're going to focus on the training. We're going to focus on these 4 steps, okay? And so when you think about a verb, there's essentially 4 parts to it. At least potentially there could be. Not every verb will have all 4 of these parts, but there's 4 things we're going to look for. You see, there's the stem in the middle that may have an augment out front. It may have a tense formative on the end of the stem, and then there's an ending on the end of it. Now, we could also say there might be a connecting vowel in there too, but again, we don't really care about the connecting vowels. That's not telling us much. We're going to ignore the connecting vowels for our purposes here. So here's the steps. Step 1 is we're going to try to identify the lexical form. This is always the first and most important step. Okay? When you see a big, scary verb that's conjugated all weird, okay, it's got endings on it and tense forms, all this kind of stuff, the first question we want to ask is, do we know the lexical form? Because here's the thing, there are thousands of verbs in the Greek New Testament, okay? And you're not going to know them all. You're going to know the most common ones. You're going to know the 50 repetitions or more. You're going to know all of those. You're going to know over 80% of the word occurrences in the New Testament, okay? But you're not going to know them all. But if you do know a word, if you see a verb and all of its scariness, and you can recognize the lexical form, you've just delimited the options from thousands to 1, okay? That is the biggest first step. And it's the reason we have to know our vocabulary really well, okay? If we know our vocabulary, when we encounter verbs, we can recognize them. And guys, that is just the most important step, is to recognize the lexical form. Also, if there's weirdness that comes with that lexical form, you probably remember that. You probably know that if you can identify the lexical form. If you can't identify the lexical form of a verb, it's going to be really hard to do much with it. We can still go through these other steps, but we're just really going to be limited. If you don't know the lexical form, you probably can't translate it, right? Because you don't know what it means, okay? You can still look for some of these other clues and these other hints, but lexical form is absolutely the most important step. So I encourage you, keep practicing vocabulary so that you can work with this. Step number 2 is to look left, okay? What do I mean by that? I mean, as you're looking at the word, look at the left side of the word, okay? And what are we looking for here? Well, we're looking for augments, okay? Or we're looking for other things that can happen on the front of a word, which we'll talk about as time goes on, okay? There's some other things that can happen up there that aren't exactly augments, but they're just signs that happen on the front that we want to look for, okay? Now, we're looking for augments. We're also looking for the absence of augments, okay? Sometimes an augment not being there is just as telling as an augment being there, okay? So step 1 is we're going to identify the lexical form, look to the, identify the lexical form as first. Step number 2 is we're going to look left. Step number 3 is we're going to look to the middle, okay? And there we're looking for tense formatives. Are there any tense formatives in the middle of the word? The sigma that we saw with the future tense, for example, does something show up there? Later on, we're going to see participle morphemes and things like that are going to show up in different ways. We're going to look for those things because those are going to tell us what's going on. They're going to tell us what they are. And so we want to take that information and use it because they're telling us what they are. We want to believe them, okay? And so we're going to look in the middle. That's step number 3. And then finally, step number 4 is to look right. In other words, we're looking at the ending, okay? Once we've done those first 3 steps, now we can look at the ending. And the ending is really going to tell us a lot. If it's a primary or secondary ending, that's going to tell us whether we're dealing with an augment on the front or not. But presumably by this point in the step, we know whether it's got an augment or not because we've looked for it, right? But since there's 4 different kinds of endings that can sometimes have weirdness and all this kind of stuff, we look to the ending last because it really helps to figure out some of this other stuff first, okay? So I want you to trust those 4 steps. Every time you encounter a verb, when you're doing your parsing homework, that sort of thing, I want you to go through these steps. Step number 1 is identify the lexical form. Step number 2 is to look left. And by the way, you can think about that kind of like a timeline, right? If you picture a timeline going from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, when you look to the left of that timeline, that's usually the past, right? And the right side of that timeline is the future. Well, augments are to the left, okay, indicating past time. It's kind of pointing to the past for you there, okay? So if you see an augment, that's going to be a signal that it's past time, okay? So yeah, lexical form, look to the left, look to the middle, to try to find a tense formative or a participle morpheme or something else going on in the middle that we need to know about. And then finally, we're going to look right. We're going to look at the ending, okay? So if you can go through those steps every time you see a verb, you'll get good at that, you'll get better at dealing with it, and you'll be able to deal with all of the weirdness that shows up that can happen with verbs in the Greek system, okay? So guys, today we learned imperfect verbs, okay? We learned about augments. We learned 2 new sets of endings. We learned the secondary active and the secondary middle passive endings, okay? So when we think about the layers that we're adding on to your knowledge, this was a pretty thick layer, okay? Feel free to watch this multiple times, spend some time here, do the homework, practice translating, get good with this, okay? We learned the Biblical Greek Made Easy method of verbal recognition. And as we end today, let me tell you one example of a time that an imperfect verb really kind of shows us something about what's going on. Okay, you remember the story where the woman with the issue of blood is trying to get to Jesus? Okay, this is the story where she touches the hem of his garment, and there's kind of this curious statement where it says Jesus felt power flow out of him, and he turned and he said, "Who touched me?" Right? Well, when it describes this woman with the issue of blood, who would have been unclean all the time, could not go to the synagogue, could not go to the temple, right? Like, is kind of this perpetual state of uncleanness. When it describes her attempt to get to Jesus, it uses the imperfect form of the verb for she was trying to get to Jesus. It's not that she tried to get to Jesus. She was trying to get to Jesus, but she couldn't because of the crowd, okay? So you don't get this sense of just some woman that, like, you know, tries once and fails. Like, no. You get this sense of she's like fighting through the crowd, maybe elbowing people out of the way. Maybe she's, you know, small and weak in stature or whatever, and she's just kind of fighting through people's legs, you know, and, you know, kind of under their elbows sort of thing. If I could just get through this crowd and get to Jesus and grab the hem of his garment, I would be healed, right? That's what she believes. And in fact, that's what happens. But that imperfect form of the verb, she was trying to get to Jesus, just tells us a little something about what's going on with her in this story. And so I think that's cool. There's going to be a few of those that we see in the New Testament as we read and translate the New Testament. We're going to see these imperfect verbs, and that past continual action is going to be really important. Guys, until next time, happy studying. We'll see you then. God bless.